A very good evening and welcome as if from St Michael at the Northgate Church in Oxford. We are having a Lenten series about writers that perhaps inspire us and mixing that up with some prayers from evening prayer. It seemed that part of that format might work with streaming some thoughts on one or two of these writers, perhaps to go alongside the little series we did during the pandemic of 7 thoughts on influential people. A slightly short and rushed and self-indulgent series indeed, so please forgive us for that. And likewise, this will be quite a rush as well, and especially when we are considering the highest selling novelist of all time, highest selling fiction writer of all time, and that is Agatha Christie. What is her attraction? I would argue that part of that is the very gentle way in which her faith and values are marbled through her works, and there are a lot of works through which that was marbled. 66 detective stories, 14 collections of short stories, longest running play in history, The Mousetrap, which has been running in London since 1952, except for a brief break during the pandemic, and her books translated widely throughout the world. There seems to be an appeal across all cultures, all backgrounds. We know that she herself had a personal faith. A friend of mine knew someone whose mother was a friend of Agatha Christie, and apparently these two elderly ladies used to race each other with their walking frames up the church path to see who could be first for matins each Sunday morning. She kept a copy of her mother's The Imitation of Christ, that great book by Thomas à Kempis, by her bedside. She was someone who took her own faith seriously. I would argue handles it very gently throughout her books, but it is certainly there, and the effects of it, the expression of faith in terms of attitudes and values, I would say, are certainly there. So very briefly this evening, 7 thoughts. Perhaps this could be said as an introduction, quote from Miss Marple, one of her 2 most famous creations alongside Hercule Poirot. Apologies for my accent. Miss Marple says, "My hobby is, and always has been, human nature." And there is a great deal about human nature in the Agatha Christie canon. Part of the world that she was writing into, and which she is describing as she's writing into it, is a world that knew their scriptures, their Bible verses. And Miss Marple says, "The children of Lucifer are often beautiful, and as we know, they flourish like the green bay tree." That old question of why do evil people seem to do so well in a worldly sense. Hercule Poirot says, "The wages of sin are said to be death." But sometimes the wages of sin seem to be luxury. Is that any more endurable? I wonder. Secondly, there is great realism about morality. We may know the verse of St. Paul to the Romans when he says, "All have fallen short of the glory of God." That's not great news. All have fallen short. Marple and Poirot pick this up. Miss Marple says the depravity of human nature is unbelievable. There's a realism that we are not the people that we would really like to be. And of course that's at the heart of the Christian story of our need for forgiveness and new beginnings and love. Miss Marple also points out how one sin can lead to another. The trouble is that people are greedy. Some people. That's so often, how things start. You don't start with murder, with wanting to do murder, or even thinking of it. You just start by being greedy, by wanting more than you're going to have. Hercule Poirot talking about a victim of a murder. He was not nice, no, but he was alive and now he is dead. And as I told him once, I have a bourgeois attitude to murder. I do not approve of it. The self-deprecating use of the word bourgeois in the early mid-20th century, and certainly towards the end and onwards, there was a sense among some people that normal standards need not apply, and that some people can live apart from normal morality. Hercule Poirot quite often comes back to this phrase, I do not approve of murder. You may think it's justifiable, you may think that the rules have changed, but I do not approve of it. Another Hercule Poirot moment, and that is he recognises that evil is habit forming. There are things that my profession has taught me, and one of these things, the most terrible thing, is this: murder is a habit. Now, to be honest, from the point of view of a reader of detective stories, sometimes we quite like 2 or 3 murders. One doesn't quite feel enough. And Agatha Christie, as a successful writer, would have known that, although interestingly, some of her works only do have the one, if that. But also what Agatha Christie is saying through Poirot is that if we do something wrong, it affects our character in some way, and we are more likely then to do a second thing wrong. It is addictive, it is habit forming. And a word about the morality of money. Hercule Poirot: if you care for money too much, it is only the money you see. Everything else is in shadow. If you care for money too much, it is only the money you see. Everything else is in shadow. That can be quite a profound observation of those over-troubled by material gain. Another point is that there is a continuing sense of ultimate justice. We may not always see it with our human eyes, but always evil, sadly, will bring its own result. This, in fact, is also a theme in the Sherlock Holmes stories, and Agatha Christie openly acknowledged her enjoyment and reading of Sherlock Holmes. There is ultimate justice. Miss Marple says, "You say crime goes unpunished, but does it? Unpunished by the law, perhaps, but cause and effect works outside the law. To say that every crime brings its own punishment is by way of being a platitude, and yet, in my opinion, nothing can be truer. And nemesis is long delayed sometimes, but it comes in the end." Hercule Poirot: evil never goes unpunished, but the punishment is sometimes secret. That appeal to a higher justice framework is quite a significant one, and it does come from Agatha Christie's faith. And the faith is taken seriously in the books. It is not often explicitly mentioned, but when it is, there's a human seriousness about it. I'm not putting that very well, so I shall just read the quotes. Miss Marple: when I am in really bad trouble, I always say a little prayer to myself, anywhere, when I'm walking along the street, or at a bazaar, and I always get an answer. And then Miss Marple on murder. Murder, the wish to do murder, is something quite different. It defies God. So for Miss Marple, when a crime, when a sin defies God, then that is the reference point. But also Agatha Christie handles it very gently and often with humour, and especially when Hercule Poirot is referring to God. Poirot says, "Doubtless le bon Dieu," excuse my accent again, I'll start again. "Doubtless le bon Dieu knows what he does, but it is odd that he should have permitted himself to fashion certain human beings. And then, if you would only use the brains the good God has given you, sometimes I really am tempted to believe that by inadvertence he passed you by." There's an emphasis on thinking clearly. Miss Marple says, "Clever young men know so little of life," and that balance between cleverness and understanding is nicely played. Miss Marple also wishes for us to see things with a larger perspective. When you only look at one side of a thing, you only see one side, but everything fits in perfectly well if you can only make up your mind what is reality and what is illusion. Miss Marple again, "If you disregard the smoke and come to the fire, you know where you are. You just come down to the actual facts of what happened." How different so many of our conversations and relationships would be, so many of our accusations would be, if we took the trouble to come down to the actual facts of what happened. And again, there are many ways we prefer to look at things, but one must actually take facts as they are, must one not? Hercule Poirot: I mean to arrive at the truth. The truth, however ugly in itself, is always curious and beautiful to the seeker after it. And Poirot again: I do not take sides, I am on the side only of the truth. And then a wonderful mix of this desire for truth, a reference to faith, and also framed in a slightly humorous sentence. Hercule Poirot: you tell your lies, and you think nobody knows. But there are two people who know, yes, two people. One is le bon Dieu, and the other is Hercule Poirot. Perhaps it's a feature of all detective stories that there is a searching for truth. We want to know what the answer really is. It's very strong in Agatha Christie, and perhaps that's part of the attraction for it. Spiritual lives matter. And this is a longish quote from one of the short stories from the Labours of Hercules, an Hercule Poirot one. It's towards the end. A goblet has been stolen, then found many years later, and it's in a convent in Ireland, and the rich man, the very rich man from whom it had been stolen, he really wants it back. Hercule Poirot finds it in the convent, and he feels it's best for everybody if it stays where it is. The financier sat up. His eyes were shrewd again. He said, and there was a faint smile on his lips, "You are a strange man, Monsieur Poirot. You shall have your way. Take the goblet to the convent as a gift in my name. A pretty costly gift, £30,000. And what shall I get in exchange?" Poirot said gravely, "The nuns will say Mass for your soul." The rich man's smile widened, a rapacious, hungry smile. He said, "So, after all, it may be an investment, perhaps the best one I ever made." In the little parlour of the convent, Hercule Poirot told his story, and restored the chalice to the Mother Superior. She murmured, "Tell him we thank him, and we will pray for him." Hercule Poirot said gently, "He needs your prayers." "Is he then an unhappy man?" Poirot said, "So unhappy that he has forgotten what happiness means, so unhappy that he does not know he is unhappy." The nun said softly, "Ah, a rich man." Hercule Poirot said nothing, for he knew there was nothing to say. There is quite a lot packed in there, and we have the faith, the importance of our souls, of our relationship with God. We have something about money, we have something about satisfaction, we have quite a lot about prayer. That's one of the longer examples in Agatha Christie's works, and it's still very short, only about half a page in a paperback, but one of the longer examples of what is just marbled throughout, very, very briefly sometimes, that faith matters, that values matter, that greed matters, and so on. In conclusion, Hercule Poirot says, "I reserve the explanations for the last chapter." And those of us who know Christie's work will know that moment in the last chapter when Hercule Poirot pulls everybody together and explains what has happened, how he's come to his decision, and who the guilty party may be. Often having deliberately led people up the garden path first, just so the murderer relaxes too much, etc. I reserve the explanations for the last chapter. For those of us living the Christian life, and perhaps any other life, for whom there are things that we just don't understand, there is that wonderful assurance that one day all will be explained, As St. Paul says, at the moment we see through a glass darkly, one day we shall see face to face. And one of the great Christian promises is that one day all will be explained. But it's reserved for the last chapter. We cannot imagine that we will understand everything while we're still halfway through the book, or a quarter of the way through the book, or 3/4 of the way through the book. We don't know how far through the script we are. But when we get to the last chapter, everything will be explained. Maybe that's part of the satisfaction of the Agatha Christie style. And may perhaps it bring some comfort and hope and encouragement to us this Lent and always. Thank you so much for listening.